Welcome, everyone. So glad that we could be together this evening. This is the workshop, Understanding and Eliminating Systemic Racism, a book discussion on So You Want to Talk About Race. So hopefully you're in the right room. If not, stay anyway, because it's going to be a good conversation. I do have the pleasure of introducing our presenter this evening, the Reverend Donald I. Hammonds. Originally from St. Louis, he's a graduate of Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. He's a member of the College of Pastoral Supervision and Psychotherapy and has served as a chaplain intern at Western Psychiatric Institute in Pittsburgh. He's worked with stage 4 cancer patients at UPMC Shadyside Hospital. He's completing his Doctor of Ministry degree with graduation slated for May 2023. His topic is Making the Body of Christ a Reality. Right now, he serves as a bereavement counselor and a pastoral therapist. He also convenes a weekly workshop with the Butler County Clergy Network, a group of white pastors and Jewish rabbis to help them understand systemic racism. He also works with several churches and groups on LGBTQIA issues. He's been married for 4 years to an artist, and they have 4 adopted boys who are 28, 26, 17, and 15. So we are incredibly glad and blessed to have such an amazing speaker with us this evening. Just a few more things. I do want to remind everybody that this is being recorded. Hopefully you got that little robot voice in your ear when you signed on. So we are being recorded this evening. The recording of this and all of the workshops will be available publicly on the Penn Central website. I specifically mentioned that for this workshop, as we're going to be asked to talk later about some of our personal experiences, also to cast back to some childhood memories. So just a reminder to everyone that whatever childhood memories you share will be on the Penn Central website for an undisclosed amount of time. So just be aware of that happening.
You know, we also have the ability to to pause recording. So, you know, just as long as we remember to start it again. So we have that ability.
That's very true. Thank you for reminding us of that, Shirley. If it comes to that point where someone would like that, yes, please let us know. Yes. And we can definitely do that. Shirley will be on the clicker for us. There are a few ways to let us know that you have something to say. You can simply raise your hand in the camera. Right now, everybody's on the same screen for me. So you can raise your hand on the camera if that works. You can also raise your hand. So you can go to the bottom of your screen. There's a little smiley face that says reactions. And one of the reactions is to raise your hand. And that will put a little yellow cartoony hand on the screen. So maybe if we're not seeing your actual hand, we'll see your cartoony hand. Or if you prefer, you can put a comment or a question into the chat box. Shirley and I will both be watching the chat box. So hopefully between those 3 different ways, we will be able to pick up on everything that everyone has to say this evening. I did want to just center us a little bit before we begin. And I wanted to do so by sharing an anecdote about Maya Angelou that is recorded in Glennon Melton's book, Carry On Warrior, which if you haven't read it, run right out after this meeting and get it from your local bookseller. Maya Angelou shared a story in her book, Letter to My Daughter. She writes about a dinner party she attended during her first trip to Senegal. She explored the decadent home and observed the elegant guests. She noticed they were all carefully stepping around a beautiful, expensive rug in the middle of the floor to avoid dirtying it. She became appalled that her hostess, would be so shallow as to value her things above her guests' comfort. She decided to act. She stepped onto the rug, walked back and forth several times. The guests, who were bunched up on the sidelines, smiled at her weakly. Angelou smiled back, proud that through her boldness, they might also be encouraged to admit that rugs were to be walked upon. A few minutes later, the servants came out, quietly removed the rug from the floor, replacing it with an equally extravagant one. They then proceeded to carefully place the plates, glasses, wine, and bowls of rice and chicken on the new rug. Angelou's hostess clapped her hands, announced joyfully they were serving Senegal's most beloved meal. She then asked all the guests to sit. Angelou's face burned. She had dragged her dirty shoes all over her gracious hostess's tablecloth. Angelou concluded her story with this: in an unfamiliar culture, it is wise to offer no innovations, no suggestions or lessons. The epitome of sophistication is utter simplicity. And I think for this evening, we will attempt to not trod all over our own and everyone else's beautiful tablecloths that will be laid out for us. We answer questions, tell stories, and share memories.
Beautifully said.
At this time, I'll turn it over to Reverend Hammonds, who will lead us.
Good evening to everyone. I didn't even have a chance to say that. I should have said that earlier. Let's bow our heads for an opening prayer. Holy One, we praise you for this event and your purpose for it. We know that when we gather together, you always have a divine agenda, and we love you for that. Even when we have done what you have asked, the results are always so much greater than we could have ever imagined. Our prayer today is that your will be done through this event. Take what we have prepared and multiply our efforts as only you can do. Steer our intentions to align with your righteous will. Remind us of your faithful provision when our efforts fail us or fall short. May all glory go up to you when we reach the finish line. Amen. As I said earlier, it's good to see all of you this evening, and I consider this a rich blessing to be able to share and talk with all of you. The more conversations that we have, the more we are open to each other, the more we can build bridges and make change in places where we want that change to take place. So that you will understand where I'm coming from in terms of my relationship with you, I'm going to tell you a very, very brief little story here about something that happened to me. Some time ago, in quiet moments, I had a deep spiritual encounter with our Lord. Within my soul, God showed me hands that appeared out of the clouds, and within the two palms, I envisioned a vulnerable soul resting within them. And the Holy Spirit put these words within my heart: as long as this tender soul is in your midst, you will love and care for it, protect it, and love all souls whom you see around you now and forever. I enter my time with you with a determination to care for you, listen tenderly to what you say, and cherish you, all of you, as God's beloved children. You are within my care as long as you are before me. You are your own precious story, fashioned by our beloved God. So let's get started with the very first section that we have listed here. And I entitled it Sharing with Each Other, listening to self-reflections on our own stories that involve race. So what I'd ask you to do first is to understand that there is a spiritual practice that I'm using that's kind of going to underline this. I'm sure all of you have heard of the term examine. It's an old spiritual and discernment practice used by St. Ignatius of Loyola. And it's used today in seminaries. It was used in mine, pastoral counselors, and others. It is based solely on reflection and discernment, recalling some period of time in your life for the purpose of learning and spiritual growth. You ask yourself questions about where was God in your life in that day, in that last week, or maybe even 40 or 50 years ago. You might want to ask yourself, where was God within discussions and the learnings that I did on racial matters? By thinking about and understanding your past, the experiences of life given to you, you can take those home. You can take your memories and your reflections home and spend more time understanding and looking at things in a different way. So who would like to begin? This will be a discussion of our backgrounds, our understanding of race as we grew up, as I've said, and what our families taught us and how our viewpoints have changed. Would anyone like to start the discussion?
Just a reminder that you'll need to unmute yourself.
I don't mind sharing.
Go right ahead.
Okay, I grew up in right here in central Pennsylvania. And when I was in second grade, I happened to grow up in North Danville Township in Lebanon County. And Indiantown Gap was just on the edge of our township. And when I was in second grade, Indiantown Gap, the area had just built a new elementary school. It was only in its second year. And Indiantown Gap was going to send their elementary children to North Danville. The children only came for several days, and you can guess why. They were African-American children. I was totally enthralled. I just thought it was the most wonderful thing in the world. And I was extremely disappointed when within about 3 days, they were absent. And I asked my mother what happened, and she tried to explain to me about how she tried to explain prejudice without placing blame. But yet, that really made a great impression on me that we could turn away people based on the color of their skin. And then my dad shared stories about his own time at Fort Bragg during World War II, when they went to eat at a restaurant and the young Black men were not allowed to go inside the restaurant, and the rest of them boycotted the restaurant then. And, and it was neat to hear my own dad share a story like that. So I ended up going into nursing and doing my nursing school at Reading. And then I went on to be a VISTA volunteer. And if you volunteered to be a VISTA volunteer and didn't say where you wanted to go, you ended up in the South. So I started off being assigned to the coastal islands of South Carolina. And later, when that project fell apart, I went to central Miami. And there too, we were working in the model cities, and I learned the sad story of what happened to Overtown, which was a beautiful area that they ran the expressway over. And so I had a wonderful experience there, and also found out when we went to spend some time with a group called the Black Cross, which was working with the Black community on drug issues. When we came out of their building after a meeting with several of the leaders, the Miami police picked us up and drove us around several blocks, explaining to us that we should not be down there as white girls, and that and they were going to insist that we got a Miami ID in case we got killed. So, just wonderful opportunities here to learn about racism. So after VISTA, I went to Philadelphia and had the wonderful experience of spending almost 25 years in an integrated church just off of Penn's campus. And that was a wonderful experience. When I had an opportunity to buy a home, I purposefully bought a home in an integrated neighborhood so my Black friends could visit without having to deal with that. So I thank my parents for raising us to see everyone as equals. And yes, I probably do have some anyway, I'm sure I have some embedded thoughts, but that I'm not familiar, may not be aware of. But I also had two African housemates for a number of years while I lived in Philadelphia.
How did you feel about the actions of the police and warning you? I mean, what went through your mind when that happened?
I was not afraid. I mean, in fact, meeting with the gentleman from the Black Cross, they even made a point of telling us that they would be sure we were always safe when we came into the city, into the downtown area. So I don't know where that came from. I've had a faith in God since I was a little kid. And I had just found myself through the years just praying through every situation. And I can't say that I was afraid. And I can only give God the glory for that.
That's beautiful. And so you got a lot of support and caring from your parents, obviously, when it came to issues of people who were different. It sounds as though you were blessed with a gift that a lot of people did not get at your age. Would that be correct to say?
I think very correct.
So
Because
go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, I'm fine. It's just that through the years, I just got to see more and more about how people were so prejudiced against people who were different. And it has, I have to say, what it's done to me through the years is saddened me and made me want to speak up where I could.
And as you look at the future, what do you think about ways of growth based on your experience that other people could benefit from? What would you say?
To live what we believe. And I found it hard coming back to central Pennsylvania, to such a homogeneous area for the most part. And I must say I rejoice when I see folks who are different than us moving in, and I just pray that we can accept everyone for who they are.
Jean, thank you very, very much for that contribution. We appreciate it. Would anyone else like to share? Be sure and unmute Bruce. Thank you, Bruce.
Yes, thank you. Well, I grew up in an interesting situation where there were no people of color in our community at all.
Bruce, can you speak a little louder?
Oh, sure. Hold on. Let me just change my audio settings, and it might be a little better. Hold on. Is that any better? Now is it better?
Oh,
It's better.
Okay,
Yeah.
Good. It's behaving itself and adjusting the volume. So anyway, I grew up in a community where there were no people of color at all, and I grew up in a very ideal world. Not because there weren't any people of color. It was because it was never seen as an issue. It was never, I didn't realize that people were prejudiced, and I assumed that my father had died when I was 9, but I assumed my mother was very, accepting of everybody. But then as I heard my relatives talk amongst each other, I found that everybody was identified by their ethnic background, whether they be Black or Italian or anything else, And that was interesting. But I had grown up with that expectation that you treat everybody equally, even though it never came, there wasn't any, I never saw any prejudice demonstrated until I got a little more aware and grew up. And then, and so I really didn't, I didn't realize that I might have had any thoughts or what am I trying to say? I didn't have any sense that I had any ideas in my head that would be less than accepting of everybody. And that took a while to figure out. I had some interesting experiences. I worked with a fellow who was African American at one of my first jobs during college, and it was really interesting to see the way he looked at life and the challenges he had that I didn't have. And when I grew up, when I married my wife, my in-laws were very fervent traditional Catholics, and they despised me because I was going to be a pastor. And it was a very interesting experience for me because I had never been in a situation where I couldn't charm people. And just if I talked them up a little bit, I was just welcomed and accepted. They could not abide me at all. And so it was really interesting to be in that situation where you just weren't accepted. And so that helped me to understand people who don't have that privilege. And then I went through a community that had a race riot back in the 90s, and we formed a unity coalition to try to deal with that. And I was just, well, I wasn't amazed that people were as prejudiced because I'd heard it, you know, in their speech and the way they referred to people that were of a different ethnic background. So it was very interesting. So for me, it's been, you know, I guess it's been learning how privileged I am. And the book we read, and I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce the author's name.
I have problems too.
Thank you,
So
thank you. I
know,
appreciate that. But
Ijeoma Oluo.
Ijeoma.
That's a mouthful. Yes.
Okay,
It's a
it
beautiful
is.
name, but
Yes, it is. Yes, and you should see what people do with Bouchard around here. Okay, I'm just telling you.
okay.
But you know, it's amazing how people have such different experiences, and the book was so enlightening. She talked about the 1,000 cuts that she got from racial prejudice, and I thought that was so insightful. In relating to my in-laws, you know, I remembered what a weight that was, what a drag it was on my life, that I could never ever be accepted, and I could never really understand. You know, I couldn't understand why they were so prejudiced, and I couldn't understand how much it made me feel badly. It was really something. Yeah.
What are some of the impacts of the things that you mentioned that happened in the past upon you as you are now, as you, like the rest of us, try to deal with racial issues?
And I didn't quite catch the question. What do I celebrate about it?
What would you say that you have found to be, let's say, not so much celebrated, but really had the biggest impact on you as you grew up and now as you see yourself?
I think it's, well, I sometimes kid with my wife that it's taken me quite a few years to understand a little bit more of how women look at things. You know, that they have a very different experience in many regards than men do, and that was very enlightening. And so I think every time you meet someone and you can try to look at life through their eyes, you know, by listening to them and hearing their experience. And that's why I like the book, because I thought she was really, you know, that she didn't have to do that. She didn't have to educate us, you know what I mean, of what it's like to be a person from a different ethnic background, but she did. And that was very helpful. And it enriches your life, I think, it helps you to understand both what you didn't have to put up with and also what other people do. And I think it makes you more compassionate.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much for your contribution, Bruce. I do
Thank you.
appreciate it. Is there anyone else who'd like to? Okay, Alyssa,
Good evening, everyone.
good evening.
I would say, so I was born in the late 80s, 1988, in central Pennsylvania, in Mechanicsburg, which at the time was, as Jean mentioned, it was very white, it's very homogenous. It's a little bit more racially diverse now, but even still so compared to many other parts of the country, I would still say it's a very white area. And I'm looking back on my childhood. I'm thinking about, there were families of color in the school district. You know, there were classmates of mine who were people of color, but it would be like there was maybe one or two Black families and one Korean family and one Indian family. And I'm thinking now about how, you know, at the time, you know, that I would go over to their, you know, to their house, and we do sleepovers, or we played on the same sports team, or, you know, we did homework together, things like that. But I think about now how, you know, I don't ever remember them talking about race with me, which to me, as I think back, means they didn't maybe feel safe sharing that with me, you know, that, and how isolating that must have been, or I imagine that it was for them, growing up in a place where there were just so few families that looked like their family, and so many families that looked like my family. And I just sort of thinking back on that with maybe some sorrow, that at the time I was just seemingly completely ignorant of that. When I went to college, I did my undergrad at Temple University, which was North Philadelphia, was a lot different in terms of ethnic and racial makeup than Cumberland County, Pennsylvania was. And it was wonderful. It was a wonderful university, a wonderful education. But I remember my very first day there, I moved in like a week early because of things that were going on with preparatory classes and things like that. And I remember I had to take a bus from the art school campus, which was right on the northern limit of the city. I had to take a bus down south into the main campus. And I remember I was the only white person on the bus. And I had never taken a city bus before. This was my very first time on public transportation. I was very nervous because I got on the bus, and then I realized I didn't know how to get off of the bus. Like I didn't know about, you have to pull the cord, or like, this was brand new for me. And I remember like this deep awareness that I was the only white person in this space. And then shortly after that, this awareness that I was 18 years old, and this was the first time in my whole life that I was in the racial minority in any given space. And it just sort of kind of overwhelmed me in that moment, that I had lived my whole life, and this was the very first time. And then also sort of reckoning a little bit with fear, and then sort of, oh, I feel afraid, but why am I afraid in this moment? And having to sort of, as I think back on it now, unpack some of that. I mean, I was anxious because I was in a new space. I was anxious because I'd never ridden a city bus and I didn't know what I was doing. I was anxious because I was starting college, but I was also anxious because now there were a lot of Black people around, and I had never had that experience before. And I liked to think of myself as, you know, I was a liberal person. I like to think of myself as accepting and loving of all people. But then all of a sudden I'm, you know, in this situation where I'm sort of confronted with maybe some racial prejudice that I had within me that I wasn't admitting, or maybe wouldn't have said that I had been aware of before. So I would say those were a couple early, as I think back into my childhood and my teenage years, that those were some experiences in terms of me sort of coming to a greater realization of my own race. I think at least, I don't know, I can't speak for other people, but for me, I don't know that I would have ever even thought of myself as having a race until I was in a situation where my race was so clearly defined over and against the other people that I was with. And that was a pretty profound moment for me.
And given all of that, what would you say are the best lessons that you've learned to get you through your future?
Oh, wow. I think one of the lessons that's really stuck with me is that the way in which geography is racialized, so the geography of my hometown, the geography of North Philadelphia and anywhere else in the United States, that's not by accident. I think that's really something that has stuck with me, and a lesson that I try to remember, that it's nothing just sort of fell into place in terms of the way our systems, racialized systems of power exist, that it didn't just happen because it happened because decisions were made by people in power to make that happen. Like I live in this pretty little town, and most of those people who lived there when I was growing up are white. And why is that? Well, because of redlining, because of the FHA loans. My grandpa, he was a World War II veteran, and he was able to buy a house because of the New Deal programs that weren't available to African American veterans. And so because of that, we were able to build some wealth, and that's how we were able to live. All of those things, and the way in which white flight decimated, North Philadelphia, and all these are not things that I knew at the time. But, at the time it could feel like, well, what a strange thing. Why is it like this? But I think just this realization that none of this is by accident. All of this is by design.
Right.
I think that's really a big lesson that I try to carry with me.
You really encapsulated a very, very important thing that I'd invite all of you to remember. We do not all start from the same place. And that is where the difficulty comes and the challenge comes. As you mentioned, for ages, for decades, we were not allowed to have loans to buy property in nice areas. We had to suffer from the government reneging on the promises that they made about, for instance, reparations, after the Civil War. There were so many things in which we were not equal. When I was a child, I went to a school. This was during the 60s, and the baby boomers were in full flower. And in our yard, our schoolyard, they had to take the yard away from us and build portables in them because there were that many students to house. Our education was badly marred by the fact that we didn't even have a cafeteria to eat in. We had to eat on the floors in the hallways because there was no place else to go and there were too many kids. We learned from books that had been written in and the answers provided and all kinds of things that most people don't associate with being in school. There was something like 45 to 50 kids per class. And it just happened that I was blessed with parents who were teachers. And so they were able to work with me, and I was able to get some of the things that I wasn't getting in school. But there was just a differentiation, and your story really, really capsulized exactly what the big problem is. we are not starting at the same place. And I don't know if you're aware of it, but back in the slavery period, after everything was said and done, there were things like slave police. I don't know if if you've heard that term before, but these were people whose only task was to make sure that Black people stayed where they were and were not allowed to come in other areas. That gets into where we are now. We are still using practices that cause immense damage to people and simply add to racial problems. I mean, that's the way it is. And in terms of economics, I read a report from Citibank, and someone there at the bank had gone back and taken a look at what the economic benefit was to slave owners. Trillions of dollars in our equivalency times. Trillions of dollars that will never be recovered. And that is why you hear talk of reparations. So I'm hoping that this helps you to understand why some of the problems exist now. And why we have things like food deserts in all Black neighborhoods where there are no places to buy decent, healthy food. And to make matters even worse, our health care has not been what it should be. And our mental health problems are through the roof. And unfortunately, I'm going to say something that may sound a little strange, but I'm going to say it anyway. What has happened is that we have picked up some damaging kinds of behaviors and practices from slave days, and we've held on to them. And what happens is we begin to enslave ourselves. And mental health is one of those issues. Because many African Americans survived slavery, well, others were killed, but there were people who survived. But they thought that because they survived, that meant that they were strong enough to handle their own problems and get out of terrible situations. That's been carried down the line. And that's why often African Americans will not get mental health care because they feel that it's nobody else's business, or they feel that, that it's a sign of weakness. And there's that thing that is passed down from generations that says, well, you've got to be strong in all of these other ways, instead of accepting that, yes, I need to seek help. So, that's just part of the story. And I'm so glad that your story helps me to illustrate that to the group. Thank you so much, Liz. I appreciate it. Anyone else want to share? Julian, go right ahead. Be sure you unmute yourself.
There we go.
There you go.
I grew up in Central Virginia, and back in the days when it was Virginia was still segregated in Orange County. To give you an idea of where it's located, 30 miles from Charlottesville, 8 miles from James Madison's Montpelier home. And I graduated from high school in '61, and we were still segregated. And the high school, the school system is countywide. the integration took place in 66. Meanwhile, I really went out to Minnesota to go to college. However, I reflected my culture right to a T. And so I walk in and to the college, and all of a certain time I see a person of color come walking down the stairs. And I said to the person who came up with me, I said, do colored people go here to college? And years later, I said to him, I did say the word colored, didn't I? He says, no, Julian, you used the N word. I say that, not that I'm proud of the fact, just to tell you, I really reflected my culture to a T. Well, I did get to know that person and other people, and we became good friends. And I'm so glad that I went to Minnesota, because I was thinking going to Texas, and I'm thinking, oh my. Now, we know that Minnesota is certainly far from perfect, and but I'm glad I went there rather than to Texas. And so I did begin to look at things differently, and so I married after my third year of college, and then then I went to seminary, and so that was in Minneapolis and St. Paul, and I served. My first church was in St. Paul, and that was really that was in Summit Avenue, and that was in 1900. Summit Avenue would have been the richest avenue from Chicago to San Francisco. A lot of very wealthy barons had built on that avenue, and the church was on that avenue only because it had been located in downtown St. Paul, close to the Capitol, and the state wanted to have a different approach to the Capitol, so they bought up a lot of land, which was land from the St. Paul's Church, and so St. Paul Church was blessed with the money, so they really built on Summit Avenue. Having said that, the first home we lived in was about 3 miles away from the church, and it was a very nice school. And all of a sudden, they decided they were going to bus some children into an inner city school, and my two daughters were among those. And it was into an inner city. In fact, it was the oldest elementary school in St. Paul, and turned out to be a very good experience for our daughters, a very good experience. And so they had a lot of nationalities there, and for the children. And but it's also in a poor region of the town. And someone mentioned about no cafeteria, and there was no cafeteria there either. However, and St. Paul at that time, they started to realize that they really needed to make some changes in the school system, though. So they really became very intentional in bringing teachers who were people of color, and certainly men of color, to provide some good role models. And I remember that for one day before Thanksgiving Day. Now, this would not happen now because of health reasons, but would you believe the custodians actually baked turkeys at home and brought them into the school? And so I carved up the turkeys. And so the children had one hot meal at least, that year. And then so they were building another school, and they soon went into that. Having said that, I want to say this, that our older daughter, she was in the 4th grade, and she just fell in love with her teacher. And I was not able to go to the teacher parent conference, but Elsie Louise, my wife, did. And she walked in there, and there was a person sitting behind the desk. And she was a little perplexed, and she saw this person, and she said, well, I wonder, is this the person the teacher, or is this the person who's the custodian? Then he stood up and said, "I, Mrs. Hall, I've been wanting to meet you." And only then did my wife realize that our daughter never said anything to us that he was a person of color. And so I really felt good about that, because the way in which I grew up, I didn't want to pass along to my children, you know. And so that was, we were making some progress there. Having said that, I then moved to the main conference for 7.5 years, and then the Central Atlantic Conference for about 11.5 years, and then I moved to Hanover in 1995. But the town in which I grew up, it was integrated really as a town in 1966. And about a year ago, it was a brief video, about an hour video, about how Orange County dealt with the issue of bringing children together when the schools were integrated. It actually went very peacefully, and it went quite well. And it did that because there were a lot of good leadership from the African-American community, wonderful leadership there, and also from the Caucasians as well. And a number of the adults were concerned, how are the children going to handle this? That wasn't an issue at all. They handled it so very, very well. And now the first homecoming queen, after the integration, the queen and also the captains of the team, they were Caucasian. The next year, there was an African-American fellow who was a co-captain of the team. The next year after that, the queen was a person of color. And by that time, they had principals in the schools also that were people of color. And then very shortly thereafter that, they had a superintendent. And so it really did go well in my hometown. Having said that, though, I mean, they had to go a long ways. I remember I grew up in a very conservative church there, and we had a person who came in for revival, and this is back when I'm in the high school, and he put something on the radio, you know, about he was going to tell his life story, and everyone should come and hear. And about 8 or 10 people of color came to the church, never had before, but they had been given the invitation. However, that was totally new to the members of the congregation, and they kind of wondered what was going to happen, but they went over and started talking to them. And then the word was, they've come for this evening, but they won't come after this evening, so it's going to be all right. Well, that tells you that you're living in Virginia, in the South, but it has gone well since then. And I have not gone back there to live, but I have a lot to learn, though. And in fact, one of the groups I joined here, it's not in here in Hanover. In fact, it's in Lebanon and Lancaster. It's called CTTT, Come to the Table. And that's a national organization, and basically it's to bring people of color and Caucasians together, and also indigenous people, and to try to get acquainted with them and hear their stories, and so we can begin to make some progress there. But I've done enough talking, but that was my background. And now, having said that, I would say this: my grandfather on my dad's side of the family, he managed a farm. He didn't own the land. He managed the farm for a doctor. And my grandfather had diabetes, and and he was quite ill at times. And my dad said when his mother would go out and ring the bell behind at the back of the house, he said, our closest neighbors would come and say, Mrs. Hall, what can we do to help? The people who came there right away were people of color.
That is a beautiful story. Your story is so rich with a lot of learning, a lot of experiences. And one of the most important things you said that you carried into your life with your children is that you were not going to pass along the things that
Yeah.
had been passed along
Yeah.
to you. That's how we stop the problem.
Yeah.
That's when we start making change, is when we can say, it's not going to happen behind this particular point. We're not going to let that happen.
Yeah.
And I think we all enjoyed your story, and thank you so much for sharing that. We really appreciate
You're
it.
welcome. You're welcome.
Now we have maybe time for maybe one more person if you'd like, or we can move to the next section, whatever you'd like to do. Okay. Your stories were so wonderful and so telling, and there were many points of learning and experience that all of you shared today. I would encourage you to remember some of the feelings that you had, that you talked about. I don't know how many of you journal, but the one way where you can learn growth, where you can see places where you have changed, is when you can turn back into that journal that you've prepared and look at some of the things that it says. I would encourage all of you to do that. If you have any way of sitting for 10, 15, 20 minutes, just think about how your family and your friends in your childhood may have impacted some of the areas that affect racial matters. That's one way that you can use it. But I thank you. I thank you very much for this particular section of our workshop. If you could just bow your heads just very briefly so we can thank God for this. Lord of light and understanding and love, we are so grateful for the souls that have shared with us today, for learning, for understanding, for discernment. You have already given us a victory of sharing and honesty and compassion, things that can be carried from this place back home from further understanding and examination. And we thank you for this. You have blessed us greatly. Amen. So the next thing that I'd like to do, all of you read the book, and I would just like to see if there are any questions from the book, anything at all that I may help you with. Because I will tell you, there are areas in there that even I disagree with. And, one of them is the idea that African Americans should not be expected to teach or help other folks understand. I disagree with that. If you don't ask questions, and if you don't learn anything, where are we going to go? I'm a great believer in sharing and conversation and contemplation and discernment. And you can't have any of those things if everyone is saying, well, I don't think I could talk to them about this. That's why we've got the book. And the book is honest, and I think it's in some places very painful, but we have read it. So that's why I want to make sure that I give all of you a chance to ask questions about that. Anyone have any questions or comments? Yes, Julian.
one thing, one part of the book, it was when the author was, she got a call from her mother. Her mother happens to be a white person. And,
Mhm.
and her mother was like, she wanted, all of a sudden she wanted to talk about race. And she said, I just dreaded this whole thing,
Mhm.
and it was so interesting. And so I thought, oh, that's right. But yeah, she was a white person, but she lived, but no, but the writer was saying she experienced life as a white person. That was a very interesting part of the book. I really enjoyed reading that. It's opened my
Mhm.
eyes in a different way.
Maybe I could help explain what may have been really a surprise underneath that maybe you might not have thought about. There's something called colorism. Have any of you heard that term or understand that term? Because of colorism, African Americans often find themselves as having very, very different experiences. And all of this came from times of slavery, when those African Americans who were brought into the world by white slave masters who had sex with African American slaves. When that happened, all those folks who were of a lighter shade were given positions inside the plantation to do work that was less menial and less backbreaking than folks who were dark. Colorism is a horrible, horrible, horrible practice. And that has been passed down within our culture. And the fact that she had a white mom meant that she was probably going to be vulnerable in her lifetime to some difficult relational kinds of things with other African Americans as well as with white people. And I know that when I was growing up, I experienced some of that. Some of my fellow students made fun of me because of my color and my features. It got so bad that during lunchtime, I would leave the school, run home to my mom and dad's garage, and have my lunch on the floor of a dirty, filthy garage because I couldn't stand the taunting and the hurt and the meanness that came behind that. And that was a traumatic thing for me that I've never forgotten. Unfortunately, my training helps me understand that trauma can be very, very hidden until something happens that causes it to trigger. I've never forgotten those experiences, and I still to this day, think about them. So color is one of those things that I hope and pray to God we get to a point where we don't have to deal with that anymore. That's another thing that's been brought down through the ages from slavery. We're enslaving ourselves by the use of that kind of practice with other people. So, and that's the reason why she had, she probably didn't want to talk about race. And that's something that impacts all of us, sadly. And it can be so unconscious, and you can not be aware of yourself and your behaviors that serve colorism to others. Okay. Were there any other questions? Okay. I think that the nice thing about this book, I think, is that it's very practical and down to earth. And there's not much in here that you're not going to understand, when she talks about what needs to be done. And what's wonderful, and I would encourage all of you to do this, is to go back to the end of the chapters where she often presents some ideas of how to make change, what needs to be done to make change. And I would really encourage you to go back and take a look at those lists. They're at the very end of the chapters. And you'll find ways in which you will discover yourself in terms of what you need to do to move further. You'll learn about things perhaps that you never even thought about, little things. And as we all know, little things build to make a big thing change. So read, go back and read, some of that. I think that might really enlighten you a bit. Okay, so we have moved through that part. Now, and there's no questions, right? Nobody has any questions or comments on the story? Okay. All right, now we're getting to something that, at least for me personally, I'll just be honest with you, I found really difficult. And that was the materials that were sent home with you guys. So I'm just going to ask you your reactions to some of the things that you read. Anybody want to start that discussion? Yes, Bruce.
I'm sorry, I didn't see those materials. What were some of the things that you found troubling? I'd be very interested. Yeah.
Now, I'm going to refresh my memory as I go along here. One of the things that really bothered me was the idea that a scientist or someone who wanted to, I guess, make divisions between types of people.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And they used this to talk about the inferiorities of people who were African American.
Mm-hmm.
And there were just some very ugly stereotypes that started back in what, the 15, 16, and 17 hundreds. And they were passed down. And people began to build that caste system. And it's really ugly. Another thing, I guess, that I'm sure all of you are aware of is that we as a church, and I'm not saying any particular denomination, but the church, ever since the voyages that were made overseas to take on land, we have been behind a lot of things that hurt a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
Indigenous people who lived in areas. And what you find in the material that I gave is that there are certain kinds of doctrines that were written, and the church came to believe that those doctrines gave them permission to do a lot of terrible, terrible things. Kill people, take their land away, take their goods away. That's been passed down. And a lot of people just got the idea that, yep, we're superior. We are better than others. And that has been taken up for so long. You see, a lot of people make the mistake of thinking that slavery was the start of racism. It wasn't. That went back centuries ago. And even to this very day, our churches still have trouble with what has now been called the most segregated hour that we have on Sundays and other days for that matter. So, you know, it's just a very, very complex, difficult system that we live under. And we are also hurt by the fact that our own history in this country is a violent one, and one full of bigotry.
Mhm.
Bigotry between Irish, you know, with Irish people who were treated horribly, Italians, people of all nationalities. And for some reason, humanity has to have superiority in some way. Most of it, I think, is brought on by fear, but it's there. It's there. And so you can see that, you know, this idea that racism, as horrible as racism is, this isn't the first go round in this country with bigotry towards various people, Jewish people. It's just something that about our psyches, I don't know, about our history. And that's something that we have to really pay attention to, and we have to really educate ourselves about. Because it's been there all along, and that's why it's so easy for us to be violent and bigoted towards other people.
It,
Mhm.
it's so amazing to me that racism, you know, you think you've gotten an improvement and things are better, and then it dresses itself up in another guise, like this whole
Yes.
critical race theory nonsense. You know, that for one thing, you know, knowing how hard it is to get sometimes schools to help children see things in a more impartial way.
Mm-hmm.
And they think that you can teach some doctrine that's going to suddenly make everybody hate each other. You know, there's already enough of that as it is. It's just, they took some graduate college course and implied that this was being somehow taught to grade school children.
Mm-hmm.
But it's amazing to me how it allowed people to be so racist, and it was so powerful. It was just very upsetting.
Mm-hmm. It is, and it's very upsetting to think that we may be moving back even further.
Mm-hmm.
You know, as time goes on. You know, we just have to be vigilant, and we have to pay attention to things and question things. I'm sorry, someone else was going to say something?
Oh, I was going to say, I was alarmed as accepting as my father was of others. He became frightened toward the end of his life of people of color becoming the majority.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, what's to be afraid of? We're all people, you know, but I see that as such a driving force right now in immigration policy in so many areas. And it just saddens me that why can't we just move forward and all work together?
Mm-hmm.
And we were not, this whole thing of what you were inferring earlier about folks using the Bible and the early settlers into later years, you know, saying that God gave us this country to be a white Christian country,
Mm-hmm.
and not really understanding. So that, you know, what true religious freedom meant,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
you know.
I
Mhm.
Go
I
ahead,
think
Isaac.
I think that we had. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
We had done a book study last year or 2 years ago on Unpoverty by Mark Lutz about microfinance, and one of the points that he makes is that if a problem seems insurmountable, that people say, well, there's nothing you can do if it looks like it can never be solved.
Mm-hmm.
And what I think we need, because I think a lot of people feel like, well, this is a hopeless cause, but I don't think they acknowledge the progress that's been made. And I think we need to take a closer look at that. I mean, I don't know where based on 2 centuries ago, I'd say we're way ahead. We're not where we have to be, nowhere near that.
Mhm.
But I think maybe just try to throw people some encouraging signs once in a while that, that we're trying and we're working to get there.
Mhm.
A lot of people, what I hear is, well, you'll never fix it. Well, I don't accept that. All right.
Mhm.
That you won't fix it if you don't. All right.
Exactly.
So you just, if we're a little bit better every day, we'll get there. But just maybe we're just not going to cure it in 6 months. You know what I mean?
I know exactly what you mean. And Harry and Jean, both, thank you for those comments, because there's a great deal of truth to what both of you have said. And it's sometimes you have to be willing to do things more slowly, or at least if you don't like the pace, do what you can with pace that's already underway. This is a problem that has developed over centuries. I don't even know if my great 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 grandchildren will solve it. I hope to heaven they do, but I don't want any of you to give up or to feel that, oh, it's just impossible. It's not impossible. It's just that we're going to have to find a way to pull together to do that. And what you all are doing right here is taking a very important step. You are all stepping forward to learn, to be enlightened, to question, to wonder, and most of all, to dream. To dream of the changes that are possible and not giving up. There is a God who is watching over us. And that is why I think it's so important for us to have conversations like we are having right now. I love each and every one of you, and I just met you. But you are beautiful as human beings who've already been through experiences, have had to learn how to accept and celebrate different cultures. You're already doing that. You're on the path. By doing this, God has put you on that path. So I just don't want to discourage anyone. And I didn't want to come in like some people tend to come in and they're ready to tear people apart instead of listening to them and bringing them together and celebrating their experiences and their growth and where they are. Every little bit counts. And I think that's how we probably should look at all of this. And as ugly as those things were, in the things that I threw up, there was truth in them. I could not disagree with some of the things that were said. It's just that it was a personal pain to me to listen to them. And that's where I kind of thought, well, I want to make sure these people get this information because it's important, and it's everywhere. I don't know if I've recommended this book to you, but the next book that you need to read, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome.
Oh,
Remember that name, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome.
mhm.
It's
We've got a couple questions popping up here. I just want to acknowledge.
sure. Let's
Shirley,
do that.
You have your
Yes.
hand up, Shirley?
Well, I initially raised it because they were in the chat. So I'm going to
Yeah.
make a comment and then and were you going to do the chat, Katie?
I was, but go ahead. You're
Okay.
fine.
No, the tension for me is, and I feel the same way about a number of issues. The LGBT community, as well as people of color, is that people are dying.
Mhm.
over the issue, whether or not it's suicide or, being shot.
Mhm.
And sometimes that mobilizes me, and sometimes that immobilizes me,
Mhm.
because I know people are dying. And um, so I just wish that we would get it figured out. That's all. That's the tension within me. Okay. All right.
That's beautiful. That's good.
Yeah.
Yes, 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 yes. Yes.
Well, let me put that together with the question that's in the chat from Cindy. Hi, Cindy, by the way.
Hi, Sandy.
Cindy says, I was wondering if you felt like we are moving backwards. And I think you acknowledged some of that, but I wanted to put those words out there.
I do, but I don't. I mean, if I go by my personal life, I certainly can't make the statement that we're going backward. I mean, I'm the first openly gay African-American man who was ordained as a minister in the west part of Pennsylvania. So there was some progress made. I mean, it may not be perfect. It may not be what some folks want, but I'll take it. And I'm gonna run with it. I mean, we can find spots that can encourage us. And we have to try to look for those spots. Don't be discouraged to the point that you give up. And when you start feeling like you're giving up, sit yourself down and start praying. Because that's probably what you need to do. And we all have fatigue of some sort from this situation. We need to acknowledge that. So we need to give ourselves some time to rest, some time to reflect, lots of time to pray, and lots of time to find ways to love others who are different from you. And you can do that. You can do it. I know you can. So, I mean, that's the other piece that I'd like to say. So yeah, in some ways we're moving backwards. I mean, I hear some of the things that are said and it's like, oh my Lord, where did that come from?
Mhm.
And you think to yourself, what next? But there's always going to be pain. No journey that's worth taking is painless. And there's no journey worth taking that hasn't had periods of moving back and having difficulty moving forward. I mean, I think that's probably pretty par for the course. Were there any other questions? I think we're getting close to the time that we need to break to end our session. But what I want to do before I end it, I had a list of ideas and suggestions. They came out of Ijeoma Oluo's book about what we can do personally. So many of us feel helpless. So many of us think, oh, we can't make a change. Yes, you can. It doesn't have to be big, sweeping movements. It can be simple things like supporting businesses that are owned by people of color. That's an important one. Start looking into all of your sources, go online, maybe turn to, publications, local publications that are operated by people of color, and find businesses that you can support. You have that choice. And remember what I said about every little bit helps? If you can all do that and make a habit of it, it can make a change. So that's one thing. Support schools by learning more about your school district and attending school meetings. Now, tongue in cheek, I should tell you, before you go to the meeting, say a prayer. Okay, stick it. I mean, say a prayer because you know what they're doing. I don't think I need to tell you what's happening to people. So that's another one. Bear witness when you see acts of blatant racism in public places, when it is safe to do so. If you see something where you know it's blatant racism, there's nothing wrong with speaking up politely, but speaking up all the same. Remember that local issues matter. They matter a great deal. That's where change often starts, is in your local community. Remember that local issues matter. Find out candidates' issues that affect people of color. Adequate housing that's affordable, adequate resources for schools, avoiding food deserts, and voting accordingly. Be aware and be a conscientious voter who looks at these things and says, I'm not going to go for that one, because the person isn't where they need to be in order to be inclusive. So that's another way to move forward. Support increases in the minimum wage because a larger number of people of color and people, period, hold jobs paying no more than minimum wage. That's another thing that you can move forward with. Give money to organizations that are working to fight racial oppression. And I'm not just talking about the well-known ones like the NAACP and the Urban League and some of the others. There are some small organizations in almost all communities that are doing something. And if you can find a way to donate to them and support their programs, do that. This is for your local community where you live. So that's something else you could do. And the last one is be concerned about health issues that impact people of color and advocate for better, accessible mental health care and awareness. And I think probably you know why I'm saying these things. So I don't think I have to elaborate on that point. So we have come to the end, and what I'd like to do, first of all, is to say thank you. It takes time and sensitivity, awareness, and deliberate choice making for you to come to this workshop, for you to be part of this workshop, and you're to be commended for it. Thank you. And I hope to heaven that I said something in there that was helpful to someone on my screen of all you lovely people. So thank you very much for the hand clap. I appreciate it. So I want to say a closing prayer. Please bow your heads. Here we are at the finish line, Lord. We're at the finish line. We thank you, and we thank you again. We glorify you. We praise you and we rejoice that you have given us yet another victory. Now, as our loved ones within this workshop leave for home, we ask traveling mercies for them and deep, persistent care for them. They are precious. I have known them only a few minutes, Lord, but I can tell you that to me, they are precious. They are full of blessings and gifts given by you. And most wonderful of all, they are yours. They are yours, your children. Thank you, Holy God. Just thank you. Amen.